Hi.
Hi.
Welcome back to In at the End.
I'm Alex.
I'm Val.
And we're going to talk about Nobody Knows Anything.
Episode 11. That was good at the same time. So as usual on this podcast, we just finished mid-afternoon on a Saturday watching an episode of The Sopranos.
Pretty luxurious.
Because, this is what we like to do in our spare time together. And yeah, we took some notes. We're going to talk about it. I was keeping secrets from Alex prior to this episode about things I wanted to talk about. So
secrets. That's good. That's good for this episode where they talk so much about secrets.
So yeah, nobody knows anything. I think
Nobody does know anything.
Kind of the
Sopranos
theme
world.
of Sopranos.
Perhaps.
Yeah, what do you want to
You've got this. You're the one with all these big secrets.
I'm the one with secrets. Well, I don't want to start with my big secret.
Big secrets? Oh my god.
But let's talk about... I want to talk about manipulation.
Okay.
Like multiple people manipulating each other and how you even know that you're being manipulated by somebody.
Okay.
Or if you do. I want to talk about the title because it comes up quite a bit. And again, I think that is kind of like a larger thing. The thing I really want to talk about is Vin Makasian. You know already. He's one of my favorite characters. And I think his arc is really beautiful. And
perhaps finalized as of this episode.
I think it is. Yeah, I mean, we still see, some little Vin Makasian leftovers pop up, with the pussy stuff going forward. But yeah, I want to talk about that.
Pretty incredible, actually, how fully flushed of a character this show can have with relatively little screen time.
Yeah. So, I'll talk about it after. I'll tell you my secret about my Vin Makasian after. I want to talk about Meadow's butterfly clips.
Okay. That seems like an excellent ground for conversation. I'm sure we can go quite far with that.
There's a lot to say.
What do they represent?
Well,
what color are
I'll tell
they?
you. I'll tell you.
Okay.
Yeah, and then kind of there's some little thoughts after that, but yeah, I think that kind of covers it for me. Is there something else that you want to...
Definitely. I feel like ambiguity is a central question of this episode.
Well, I think that goes with the title, right?
It does go
nobody
with the
knows
title.
everything. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. And we do hear that line coming up multiple times in the episode, and I think that's a very central part of this episode in particular, and obviously the show.
So maybe let's start there.
Okay.
So ambiguity, nobody knows anything.
Well, we have the first time we hear nobody knows anything is when it
comes to back
when it
pain.
comes to backs, nobody really knows anything.
Yeah. Nobody knows anything.
And it's
really
interesting, actually, because that immediately edits to the therapy session where there's a talk about secrets. And then there's this super close-up on Tony's face, which is interesting because there's also a super close, or not as much of a super close-up, but a close-up on Paulie's face when he mentions that line of nobody really knows anything. And if I know anything, it's that if we hear a line in this show that's referenced in the title, there's definitely some importance there.
Yeah, it was even actually more clear than that. You said it was nobody really knows anything. It was actually nobody knows anything, really.
Okay.
So it was actually the clip of the title.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, and then we also hear it near the end where Tony's yelling again
I
at
can't find
Paulie.
pussy anywhere. Nobody knows anything.
Yeah, well, nobody knows anything. And the really interesting thing about that, too, and the topic of ambiguity for me is how much Tony needs clarity in his life. In fact, right before that, in that final scene, he starts yelling at Paulie and he says, "Did you do it? No. Did you do it? No." Mm-hmm. Pushes him against a fridge, yells, "Did you do it?
Don't you lie to me."
Did you do it? No.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's wow, that's a lot of times you needed to ask that question. And I think also we have earlier in the episode where Tony's talking about outside it's the 1990s. Perhaps a great segue into your butterfly clip.
That's for later. Yeah.
Outside it's the 1990s. Here it's 1954. Tony's somebody who really struggles with this. And in his home environment and in that scene and near the end, he requires clarity in these kind of complex situations.
Yeah. Well, we have a great kind of indicator of that when Tony is by himself smoking cigarettes.
That's
and
huge.
They're trying to figure, he first tells Pussy that he first tells Paulie that it's Pussy who's wearing a wire. And Pussy asks him, how sure are you?
Yeah.
And he says 90%.
Right.
right? And then he says, we need to be 110% sure,
yeah.
right? So it's like...
Well, which also, how could he even be 90% sure? It seems like he's really struggling he's in a race to get to that 100%.
Yeah.
For somebody who sees things in such black and white terms, he needs to either be at 0 or 100%.
Yeah, but I like that he chose
that middle ground
90
is very
and
difficult
110,
for him.
right? Like...
Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting
It's
one.
very interesting. Also, actually, when he's talking to the madam about Vin Makasian, that shot starts on a white statue, which we were talking about a ton.
How did we get to white statues all of a
because
sudden?
we were talking about this in the last, I think it was the last episode, in the black, maybe it was 2 episodes ago, but the black and white color scheme about these decisions that need to be made, where he was talking to Artie.
Right.
And we have a focus on a lot of colors, black and whites, and they're in the garden near the end, where Artie's saying that he can't go and kill the soccer coach, that they can't do it, and the shot is left with them kind of like, or him wrestling with this conflict and this ambiguity of how to deal with an issue of this white statue, also the white statue versus the black hat in the restaurant.
I know, but how did we get to this color conversation here?
We're getting to this conversation because it's reflecting the need for certainty that Tony has.
Okay.
Even when he's reflecting on Vin Makasian, he's thrown into this mix-up over Pussy, and he requires an absolute white or an absolute black answer.
Yeah, totally.
There's an absence of nuance and an absence of complexity in terms of what can exist in these situations. It needs to either be 100% or 0%.
Yeah. 100% or 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think Tony's like a master of that kind of ambiguity, though, even though he requires it. Like, he really requires this like black and white conceptualization of people generally, right? Like, he needs that with people's race. He needs that with people's like cultural grouping and like all sorts of things. But when Jimmy comes to his house, right? Jimmy gets out of jail. He goes down to the basement with him. Tony actually gives the most ambiguous answers, right? Like, he just like doesn't answer any of Jimmy's questions.
Well, he knows how to engage in that.
Yeah, and that kind of goes into the manipulation thing that we want to talk about a little bit later.
That's where he's comfortable. But once he knows what to do, he knows how to manipulate those situations perfectly.
Yeah. So I thought that was an interesting part of it. The other thing about kind of maybe it's not really quite the ambiguity, but it definitely is this sense of uncertainty. Tony talks about this impending sense of doom with Melfi, like right after it cuts from that scene into the therapist's office, right? The first thing he talks about is this impending sense of doom, like he's looking for a sink to drop on his head or something like that. And so it kind of is always this sense of like not knowing what's coming, but feeling this sense of dread that like of what's going to be around the corner, right? So you're always kind of on the cusp of these like huge emotional reactions, for example, right? To like just hearing one piece of information, although it's an important piece of information. Like him pinning Paulie up against the fridge was not really necessary. No. There's nothing.
Especially since he'd already got the answer twice.
He'd already got the answer, right?
Pretty simple.
So, but that is kind of that sense of like you never know where it's going to come from. And in this episode as well, we have it first it's Pussy and then it's Jimmy, right? I think. Yeah. I mean, I think I know at this point that Pussy is also wired, but I think
we'll see.
We'll see. I think we're allowed to talk about things that happen in the future in this podcast.
Maybe with the shade of uncertainty, like everything in this show.
You want to shade everything with uncertainty? Yeah, I mean, I don't think that takes away from the fact that Pussy may be wired.
Well, it does for Tony.
But in their mind, it does, yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
Right, but all those questions that they were asking, have they disappeared? About Pussy in particular.
I don't think so, because but like the episode leaves it there, right? So when they are talking, like, so they're like, it's Jimmy. Jimmy's the rat, right? It's Jimmy, yeah. And then they're like, well, when did you last see Pussy or whatever? Oh, did he take the shvitz?
Yeah.
And Paulie's like, no, he refused to. He kept his clothes on. And they all kind of like look at each other.
That's right.
Like Tony has this look on his face that, like, it's not gone. And we know that it's never going to be, and again, spoiler, it's never going to be gone from Tony's subconscious as we venture even into the next season.
And yet he seems to be excited about having cracked this or figured it out.
Totally.
And in a way, that conundrum seems to be sort of solved for him. And we can talk with the benefit of hindsight of seeing the show lots of times. Where the show goes from here, he seems to have kind of solved that problem.
Yeah, but I think, like I said, like it's implanted in his subconscious, and that definitely impacts him going forward.
It does.
Yeah.
It's interesting, actually, because when Paulie is with Pussy at the sauna, I think his last line to him is, "Why don't you want to take them off?" And then he gets that basically, "Fuck you" response. Yeah. But there's definitely no closure to that question. And we're left with that. And
Pussy's good at manipulating, well, if he is in fact wired. Pussy's extremely good at manipulating both Tony and Paulie, right? Like when Tony comes to his house and he's sitting there on the chair, right? He like deflects the attention to different things, right? He has these excuses all right on the tip of his tongue, right? Yeah. Like my doctor says.
It's actually, I mean, it's extremely
and it's
believable.
Plausible and believable. I just have a note in that scene where Tony comes to see Pussy and he's sitting in that chair. There's actually, he's like sitting on a heating blanket or something like that, but there's actually like a wire coming from his body where he's sitting. Yeah, it's like the wire of the heating blanket. I thought that was pretty good. And then also in the scene where Tony's talking to Silvio outside the Bing, there's these really clear like wires in the background, these electrical wires.
Well, that's an interesting shot too, because actually as they frame it, it kind of comes from being in the parking lot to actually kind of flipping around, and at the end you see Tony from a completely different angle, where now it's looking at Tony, behind him is the highway, and behind that is just a row of greenery. And I feel like we're really meant to be left with him contemplating these kind of like large questions of him dealing with the mortality of other people. And as we've seen, greenery kind of representing mortality. In fact, even in this episode, water and greenery with Vin Makasian in the very beginning, kind of foreshadowing what's going to happen. And we've seen that kind of symbol language kind of set up, especially in college and a lot of episodes to this point. We see Tony wrestling with these huge problems and these huge ideas that he needs to figure out.
Yeah, there's another shot of greenery that really stood out to me, and I think it goes back to kind of our idea that nature kind of represents these areas that Tony doesn't have control over in some way. So there's this really like almost too long shot of their house. And you see how isolated their house is. Like, it's a long shot. I didn't count how many seconds, but it's this long shot of their house kind of nestled in this natural environment, right? And, like, his house is an area he has domain over. After that shot, it goes into that conversation where he says, outside it's 1990, but in here it's 1954, right? So it, like, kind of highlights that he does have control over what goes on, to some extent, what goes on in his home, but it's surrounded by these realities and these ambiguities and, you know, like, do you talk about sex with your children or whatever it might be. Also, that's where Meadow's butterfly clips do come in. Nature.
Wow.
I know. I know. Butterfly clips were so all the rage in 1999. So.
Butterfly clips. The ultimate metaphor.
Also, in that scene on the news, they're talking about how the cop that got busted in this raid, right, which has been Vin Makasian. And as they're saying he's on administrative leave.
Cop on administrative leave.
AJ is drinking orange juice.
That's right.
I caught that. Alex had to go back and look at it to make sure. But
wow. Talk about secrets. Was that your big secret?
That was my big secret. That you think you pay attention to color and orange juice.
But that's also another, we have the Godfather horn that Paulie has. That's another appropriation of symbology. Taking the orange juice. And I would recommend if you're watching the show, well, for any time really, but look out for orange juice in this season because there's some episodes coming up where we might be seeing some more oranges.
All right.
Foreshadowing some things.
Spoiler.
You're
going to see some oranges. So I want to talk about Vin Makasian.
Okay.
And I've said this in past episodes, like, he's one of actually my favorite characters in the series, and he's only in it for a very short time.
Well, you can tell me because you found this YouTube channel.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to tell you.
Oh, is that your big secret?
It's not my big secret, but let me tell my truth.
Okay.
So I should have looked up his name on YouTube. I'll post it in the links in our show if you're interested in this. But there is this YouTube channel where somebody has pieced together like all the scenes in which certain characters are in. It hasn't done all of them, and like there's some characters that would just be super long, but he has pulled together all the clips of Vin Makasian. And I think his total screen time is something like 24 minutes. And I don't know how many minutes there's been of the first season so far, like up until this point.
Right.
But it's not a ton of time, right? We don't spend a ton of time. I mean, it's significant.
We're on episode 11, so...
Maybe it's not even that much. Maybe it's like 17. I don't know. Like, it was... I should look it up. And again, I'll update this with the right information. But I always knew I loved the character of Vin Makasian, and I always thought about his arc in this kind of simplistic way. Like, it's kind of this guy's descent to death, right? Like, it's almost in some, like, from one perspective, it's this, like, straight down arc, right? Like, not that he really started anywhere great, but, you know, like, so it's this guy.
But that's the fascinating thing about this show, is that it starts people on an arc that's in a place that we're not comfortable with or used to. I mean, that idea of something starting so low and just descending out of a graph.
But the thing about this episode is that you actually get some pieces of Vin that fill in some of the other parts of his arc. And so he tells Tony that story when they're both at the bordello, or whatever they keep calling it in this episode, a whorehouse, as Meadow says. And Vin is telling Tony, for kind of a strange, I don't really know what the reason behind him telling Tony this story is, about how when he was a kid, his dad used to abuse his mom. Yeah. And to deal with that, he would go and hide under his bed and go to sleep there and then wake up like everything was normal. And so that gives you some of Vin's backstory. We hear also a little bit of Vin's backstory. Like, we know that somehow he got in with gambling, right? He talks about how Tony has this ability to sum up a man's whole life in a sentence, which is this, like, also this very black and white view, right? And maybe that's how Vin views himself, as a degenerate gambler with a badge, right? That's what Tony calls him. He says you can sum up his whole life. But that misses out on this other part. Vin Makasian was a child who lived through abuse, right? And then post his death, right, then we'll talk about his death scene in a moment, I'm sure. But then post his death, we get this insight into who he was as a man from the madam of this bordello. And she says he helped her out of more than just legal issues, that they had this very intimate relationship where they would discuss kind of both of their problems and internal struggles, right? Like, really, like, akin to therapy. And she makes that connection to therapy.
Who wouldn't want to sleep with their therapist? Who
wouldn't want to sleep with their therapist? But he clearly actually, like, really respected her and trusted her. And she then discloses to Tony that he actually really respected and trusted Tony.
Well, that's a really interesting line. At least with Tony Soprano, you know where you stand.
Yeah, and that black and white kind of thing, right? Like, you either know or you don't know. In some senses, like, we know that Tony really didn't respect Vin Makasian, right? Like, and he wasn't always, well, maybe he was clear about where Vin stood with him. He was pretty upfront with it. Yeah. But anyway, so we get these, like, other little pieces of Vin's life that we don't see on screen, but that kind of flush out his arc into something that isn't quite necessarily this downward descent. There is he does give Tony some information that was really, really relevant to him, right? The other stuff he was doing for Tony didn't seem like it really helped out, like trailing Melfi or whatever else he did, right?
Yeah. Beating up Melfi's boyfriend.
Yeah. But anyway, so watching this YouTube channel that I mentioned that I don't know the name of, but watching it and seeing the art kind of in its entirety, they actually included that posthumous scene with the madam. And I was like, oh, like, that's a way more fleshed out character than even though I always loved him, than even I remembered him being. And again, in this very short time, in this not even a full season of knowing him. Yeah.
Well, what's fascinating too is how unempathetic Tony is during that story about him dealing with abuse and hiding underneath the bed. Tony's just rolling his eyes, falling into the bed, and actually Vin Makasian says at the end, you're a dick to the end. Yeah. And what's another interesting thing about that is that as he says that, he kind of walks towards a painting, which is a little bit blurred, but it's kind of like a blurred landscape painting right after that line.
Oh, interesting.
You're a dick to the end. And then he kind of he's kind of continuing to deal with this sort of abuse from, another character close to him. Yeah. And then walks towards that painting, which we've come to see as symbolizing the afterlife.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's interesting, right? And we get some other references to water. Like we see him standing in front of his bridge, like that bridge that he later jumps off of early in the episode.
A symbol there, yeah.
Sopranos Autopsy talks a lot about bridges and death and that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah.
So it's definitely like it hits you over the head. I mean, like every time you see Vin, he's in front of this bridge basically, or something like it. The other thing about him, I forgot to mention this in my last little tangent, but we also there's this kind of throwaway line where Tony's like, well, how do you know you can trust the guy who told him that information?
Yeah.
And he was like, he was in my wedding, he's not gonna lie to me.
Yeah.
So you also get this sense of Makasian's history. Like he does have, or he at one point had good friends who stood up with him at his wedding. He's no longer married, you know. We know that about him already too. But there was a time in Vin's life where maybe things looked a little differently.
Yeah.
And Debbie, the madam, talks about that after. Like he was just really unhappy with where his life, how he turned out, and where his life ended up. And that's a really deep thing. Yeah.
The interesting thing with him too is how this theme of ambiguity creeps in, because we have this scene where he starts to really open up, almost like a kind of psychotherapy session where he's talking about his history of abuse, his childhood to Tony. Tony's actually on a couch, completely uninterested.
And reclining.
And it's interesting for us as viewers who are so invested in Tony's stories of dealing with his subconscious and wrestling with these topics of identity and who he is and how he's got there. And we just completely shut down on this other character. Yeah. And it's left in a place where we really don't know enough about that to have an opinion about where he comes from, what that means, how these things affected him. And we're so invested in Tony's, and we're sympathetic to Tony, and we listen to him, and we kind of try and wrestle with why he's turned out the way he has, but we're just completely left out of it with Vin Makasian, and we're left with this kind of ambiguous story that we can't fully piece together. And I think that's part of the point.
That's why I think it's so compelling, right? Because it definitely does. It leaves you being like, oh man, did I know this guy at all?
Yeah.
Like, was what we saw of him the true Vin Makasian?
Yeah.
Right? Like, was he always a total shitbag? A dick till the end? And I love
Tony's
that.
the dick to the end.
Well, yeah, but you know what I mean? Like I think the things that characters say about each other are often reflective of who they are as, themselves too. But yeah, I just think it's so artfully done. And like David Chase is just the master of these kind of character, like playing us with these character arcs that are so ambiguous, right? And again, like making us struggle to characterize a character as good or bad, or and that's the point of this show.
That's certainly the point of this show.
Yeah. Anyways, I just love that arc. I'll miss Vin Makasian. R.I.P.
Yeah.
His death scene.
Yeah.
Is one of the craziest scenes. There's some scenes in this episode where I'm like,
really takes you by surprise,
who was the
especially
director?
The first time you see it. This was directed by Henry Bronstein.
Do we see him again?
I'm not sure, actually.
Frank Renzulli, the writer.
I think we've seen him writing 3 episodes already this season. Yeah.
But some of the directing, like, so that scene where Vin is driving, right? We see him in his car. It's right after he gets out of jail. Yeah. Right? He has all his stuff like in an envelope that they, your personal artifacts. He gets out. He's driving in this terrible traffic across a bridge. There's this cop who's there, right? Who, like, Vin's, like, just laying on his horn. And there's this other cop who's there who actually, like, treats him quite nicely. Like, oh, we have a police officer here.
We have a detective.
Go ahead, detective. Like, and treats him with a lot of respect. Yeah. Right? And then, so we're like, okay, he's going whatever. He's going somewhere.
He's in a rush.
And he's avoiding this traffic. And we know it's kind of suspect that he's using his badge. Of course, he's on suspension, right? Yeah. So his badge is not really relevant or valid or whatever the word I'm looking for. But then we see him pull in between these pylons, right? So there's construction going on. So he, like, actually pulls onto the other side of the pylons. Yeah. He's crossed over from where everyone else is, and he's crossed over to this other side where it's void, right? There's nobody there. Yeah. And so abruptly stops his car.
Yeah, it all happens so fast.
Gets out. It's so fast, abruptly stops his car, gets out, puts his badge on, climbs up, and then dives headfirst into the water. Yeah. And I love that series of shots that we get, right? Like, we get a view, like we see him from the water jumping, and then we see him from the other side of the bridge falling, right? Like there's a view from the other side of the bridge. It's like these amazing sequence of shots.
Yeah.
And it's so, the first time you see it, it's so shocking. But even this time, you know what? Like I knew it was coming, obviously, but it's still shocking.
It is.
You're still like, and she and Debbie and Tony discuss it later on, like, and she's like, maybe that was the straw, like, because he was like, well, why did he do that? You know, like he could have just been suspended.
Yeah.
And we don't know. We don't know why it is that he decided that was the out for him, and we never get to know that.
Yeah.
We
know the basics in broad strokes. We know some of the things that were happening, maybe some stressful events and situations.
Yeah,
but that's about it.
But you also, like, it comes very unexpected. You don't, even though you know he's in this dire situation, you're not anticipating that that's what's coming.
No.
Unless you paid attention to all the times we see him in front of bridges.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if this episode doesn't truly establish that as one of the symbols they like to use, I don't know what does. And actually, it's interesting because at the very end of the episode, what do we have? We actually have a few things. We have Mikey talking about Tony. Mm-hmm. And behind him is a picture of a sailboat on water.
Yeah.
Right next to his face. And then there's actually a fade to a bridge with Tony in front, and that's the end of the episode.
That end is also so impending doomy. Like,
it sure is.
There's this music playing.
Yeah.
It's this from the scene with Mikey, there's this fade to the scene of Tony we don't see used very often, these like fades.
Yeah.
And so that really, like, it overlaps, you know, like you see one scene fading into the other. It's very powerful. Yeah. But yeah, then that music is playing. You just see him standing there.
Yeah. Also, another example of the show using kind of like a bookending kind of technique, because near the beginning of the episode we have Makasian out by the water seeing a bridge where
and he's taking AJ fishing. Tony's taking AJ fishing.
He was, but that's a great scene because you see they drive down a kind of like laneway to get to the water.
It's so like it's like a boat launch.
A boat launch, yes. They're getting as far away kind of from the land as possible.
Yeah.
And that shot of Vin Makasian standing at the end of it, looking out at the water. I recommend when you're watching this show, if somebody is out looking at water and there's a lot of water and the composition of the frame is essentially all water with a person in one of the lower extremities looking out over it in contemplation, there's probably something bad about to happen.
What's the name of the house they end up buying on the
that's the Whitecaps episode.
Whitecaps, yeah. Mm-hmm. Watch out for Whitecaps.
Oh, watch out for lots of things. But again, even there, once the camera work starts to change, we see Vin with kind of greenery, that kind of side of the boat launch. He's kind of talking in front of that. So a sense of foreshadowing for sure about what's gonna be coming.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's wow. Do you want to talk about the manipulation piece?
Yes.
And then we can talk about some of the like extras.
Yeah.
I think like there's a lot, like there's so many characters manipulating each other here. I wanted to focus the most on Livia.
Yeah.
Because she's actually, she's definitely the master of manipulation. And she's manipulating three main, maybe even four main characters if you count that very small office manager woman at Green Grove. But she's manipulating Tony, she's manipulating Carmela, and she's manipulating Junior.
Yeah.
And none of them really know that they're being manipulated, but a lot of them can see the other person being manipulated.
Carmela's right.
In one of the first scene, in one of the first scenes though, Carmela's on the phone with Livia.
Yeah.
And she's like, "You're not coming? Like, no, we want you to come. We want you to be here." And Livia's like, no. And then she goes to Tony and she's like, "Your mom's not coming."
Yeah.
And he's like, "That's what she wants."
Yeah.
That, like, she wants the sympathy. Like, that's what she's trying to do. And and Carmela's like, "I should probably call her back."
Right.
Right. And Tony's like, "That's what she wants you to do." But Carmela is brought into it. Right. You even see it when she goes to see Livia later, bringing the pie from the party. Right. Like, she's still, like, she feels guilty that Livia wasn't there. And even in that conversation, like, she's rolls her eyes at Livia for some of it, but you could tell, like, as a mother, right, she is also moved by some of the things that Livia is experiencing, right? Yeah. And Livia's using that. She's like, just wait till you're abandoned, right? Like, she's using all these things that she knows can manipulate Carmela, but Carmela can't see herself being manipulated. Tony can see Carmela being manipulated.
Yeah.
Carmela can see Tony being manipulated. Yeah. She says to Livia, I hate, like, you know you're doing this to Tony, right? Like, you know what you're doing. Yeah. And I hate to see him like this, and you're killing him. Yeah. Which is a good line also. Yeah. You're killing him. Yeah. Because she is trying to kill him, actively trying to kill him. And then with Junior, right? Like, she's so adept at manipulating Junior. And the feelings she has towards Junior, I think, are really complicated. And they even come up kind of from her subconscious, right? When she's talking to Carmela, for example, she says, like, something about, like, he's my husband's brother, like, what would you think about me getting, like, what would people think about me getting involved in him? And Carmela's like, I didn't say anything about that, right? Like, so it does kind of, like, come out of her subconscious. But, yeah, she and Junior's relationship is really complicated, but she definitely is running Junior. Junior always seems so confused, and we get more into Junior's confusion later, but he's always like, what? Like, and he has this, like, puzzled look on his face, and you can see his wheels turning, right? Yeah. But she knows, and then she's like, aw, what did I say? You know, like,
well, she definitely knows how to withdraw herself from the situation and come across as this kind of detached, uninvolved person.
Yeah.
She talks about power, what power, and she's in this chair that I feel like is kind of being like identified as like a throne. Yeah. She's really the one who's kind of dictating the direction of a lot of these conflicts.
Yeah.
And also, it was interesting when she said, at least with Junior, I get some purpose in my life, which is interesting in terms of her identity as a character, in terms of how she's engaging with these people and how she's involved in these kind of mob affairs.
Yeah. Well, I meant to say how she's manipulating that, like, director of Green Groves. I love how Tony shows up and he's like, where's my mom? Yeah. And she's like, she's getting aqua therapy with the ladies. Like, she's selling herself as this other person in that environment of Green Groves, right?
Right.
But doesn't want Tony to know.
Yeah.
But also, like, wants to kind of go unsuspecting, right? Like, she doesn't want to call attention to herself in that environment because she can keep doing what she does best. Yeah. She's the one who's having meetings at Green Grove. She's like bringing more higher power people than Tony is, right? Like, she's having all these secret meetings with Tony and with Junior.
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting. There's that line with Junior where Junior says, "If I don't act," and then Livia actually, or Nancy Marchand, I guess, kind of like actually like actively looks away down to the bottom right after that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's the key to her power. It's not so much that she does things, it's that she looks away.
Yeah.
She puts things out there, and then she lets other people kind of control where they're going to go.
Yeah. No, Nancy Marchand is an amazing actor. I think, you know, well, with her, but also with a lot of the other actors in this episode, you really just saw their acting chops, if you want to call it that, because their faces show this experience of these ambiguous moments, right? Like, we see Tony's face change in these really beautifully subtle ways that really show his thought process, and we see that with her too. Like, we know when she knows that she's done what she needs to do, and then she can put on this like, what are you talking about, and the crying into the tissue, and but the acting in this episode, I think Tony and Livia,
pretty incredible. Yeah, James Gandolfini, so multidimensional.
Like, oh my gosh,
so much going on. Yeah, I love actually that first scene where there's that scene where Vin Makasian's talking about his abuse as a child, and Tony's kind of exasperated and showing his lack of empathy. Also in the first scene, just like little things, like Pussy's walking down after his back is pulled and he's walking slowly down the stairs.
Yeah.
And Tony's kind of like rolling his eyes. He's definitely a character. It's interesting because he's definitely a character with a lack of empathy and ability to really care that much about the problems of others, which is ironic because we're so invested in his personal psychological problems. But then he also can be so caring at times in a way that does draw us to him, in a way that makes us invested in him as a person. It makes it hard to hate him.
Well, even though he doesn't care about Pussy's back pain, really, I mean, except for like kind of how it impacts him, he clearly cares about Pussy.
Well, that's a great example in this episode of him really, truly caring about something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But outwardly, he's able to kind of show that nonchalance or
Yeah.
whatever the right word I'm looking for is, or just
Yeah.
like disinterest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing in the manipulation, actually, that was really
Yeah.
interesting was the use of food in scenes. So you actually had Carmela bringing this ricotta pie to Olivia,
Right.
which we've learned is actually a ricotta pie.
It is.
Probably did not know that on a few viewings.
Oh, I did.
Ricotta? I
Yeah.
don't know. Well, no, I do know.
Okay.
Anyway. And then going to this scene of Carmela actually trying to be upfront and to discuss these issues with Livia and to try to kind of like take control and to alter the way people are behaving against each other. And then Tony bringing the cannoli to Pussy. In both situations, it's people bringing foods to loved ones, but the food's not really the purpose. It's actually to kind of like cover over what they're actually there for, what their true intentions are.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
That is interesting.
Using food as kind of like a tool to kind of manipulate people or to kind of like get in the
door.
what you actually
kind of.
want.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah.
Cool. The one I just had like a minor thing. Do we ever get like a 4 days later again in this show? So at the beginning we have that scene where they get arrested, right? At the whatever it is that's going on
Bordello?
not at the bordello, at the pool hall at Jimmy's.
Oh right, yeah, the FBI raid.
Yeah. Where is that taking place? I don't really even know.
That is at the back room of Satriel's.
Really?
I think so, yeah.
It doesn't look like it.
I think so.
I feel like it's somewhere else that Jimmy has. I feel like it's like Jimmy's place.
No, I don't
Jimmy's
think so.
Corner.
Jimmy's Corner. Great bar in New York if anyone's
Yeah.
looking for a place to go in Times Square.
Anyways, maybe we can confirm that. But anyways, so we have that scene there where Jimmy gets arrested, Pussy runs from the FBI, and then ultimately gets arrested. And then we have 4 days later.
Right. Yeah, unusual technique for this show.
And Pussy's out.
Yeah. Typically the show just has such realism in the way it portrays everything. We don't have those kind of techniques used very often.
Yeah.
So they really
I don't
do
know that we
stand
ever
out.
see it again.
I don't think so.
Do we ever have like 4 days earlier? That's such a cheap trick.
I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
The show would do that. That's a great scene too, actually. I love the use of music there. They have these kind of like distorted guitars like kind of tuning up and kind of like these like blasts of chords. We know it's such a sense of foreboding that something's just about to happen.
Yeah.
Because it's like this concert's about to start, but
Yeah,
we're not
yeah.
quite there.
Yeah.
And when they kind of kick in the door, they start. What's interesting is that when Pussy leaves, the music goes blank.
Right.
So it really kind of has a contrast between inside the club where the raid's happening
Right.
and the outside world.
Right.
I thought that was super effective.
Yeah. Why do you think Pussy ran?
Well, that's a great question.
Because if he's already, like, listen, we have to talk about
Yeah.
this, but spoilers, okay? Unless you've...
Well, or no, we're just talking about it from the context of this episode.
Sure.
What do we think is
But
going
if Pussy wasn't wired at that time, okay, then I understand him running.
Mm-hmm.
But I do believe he is wired at this time. So the way he was looking at the FBI agents, he was like,
Yeah.
there was these scenes of like him making not kind of eye contact. Like he was like really looking at all these agents.
Yeah.
And we see him doing that.
Yeah.
And then he looks at the
It's
door.
too obvious for
and
this
then
show,
he,
though.
I
Sometimes when the
know.
show feeds you things that are...
But like, I'm not saying it's obvious, but I'm saying like, I don't know why in that situation, if he already knew, like if he's already working with the FBI, he would have known that he would have gotten out.
They're definitely
Right?
suggesting that
Yeah.
through the way that scene is done. But I think that's
But I
what
just don't know why he would have run. That's all. And
There's
and then the guys don't know why he ran. They're all like, "Why'd you
Yeah.
run?" And Junior's
Well,
like, "We don't run. That's embarrassing."
There's a strong insinuation that he would be wired. And
Yeah.
we've received information that suggests it, and his actions definitely suggest it. But again, what's happening in the show is we don't know. We will
Yeah.
never get to an 100, or certainly not an 110% level of clarity.
We don't
and we
even
have to
get
deal
to
with
it,
that
ever.
ambiguity.
Yeah.
And these characters always have to deal with that
Yeah.
ambiguity. And that's what the show is about.
Yeah.
There's some other major questions of this show. Does this happen? Does this person die?
Right.
Perhaps. But
Good questions.
good questions.
Yeah.
Do they die?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have the tendency to come out and say, for sure, he died. There's this. And there is evidence for sure. But I don't think
Talk
that's what
about
this show is about.
spoilers.
I'm not spoiling anything. That's not what this show is about.
No,
it's not about giving a black and white answer to...
But the show, it's such a genius show because they drive you to try so hard to try to solve these ambiguities, right? They're unsolvable. And that's the thing with life, right? They're unsolvable.
That's the...
But that's the genius of it. That's
where the true focus is, I believe.
Yeah.
It's on that ambiguity and
it's
that
on
inability.
It's on art. It's focusing on our desire to solve those ambiguities, right? Like, it's actually playing with the audience and saying, look at you, fool. Like, you're trying to solve this for so long. Like, it's not solvable.
Well, and frankly, if you look at all the material that's developed in this show, the themes of ambiguity, of life being mundane at its core for everybody, this kind of bleak worldview, those are all themes that are so much more developed than the kind of like gangster who killed who mystery solving element of the show. In fact, those elements are like actively repressed. So when you watch the show and that becomes the focal point, I think it's missing something that is being dealt with and thought about and presented at such a higher level.
Yeah. No, there's so many layers to this show. You really, like, you can think of, like, just that concept in itself on so many, like, on how the characters deal with, on how the audience deals with it. Yeah. What Chase's intention was. It's really, like, it's incredible.
Yeah, it is. It's our favorite.
It's our favorite show.
Did you guys know that? We like this show.
The only other thing I kind of want to just talk about briefly, and maybe you have some other things, I just love the scene with Paulie and Pussy. Again, like, I always forget how little we've seen of Pussy.
I know.
In this show, and
this is almost like his rollout episode.
I wish this YouTube channel, I don't think they have Paulie up yet, but we really see so little of him in this first season, and in this episode we really see him and his craziness, right? I love how he's referred to as a psycho multiple times in this episode. But
fair.
Which I think was really funny also, but he, like, that scene at the bathhouse or whatever, the shvitz, which I think, and you know, it is that ambiguity, right? Like, on the outside, that is a nice thing to do for your friend who's experiencing back pain, right? And so Paulie is manipulating this situation as well in this, like, really creepy way. But then he's like, take your clothes off, right? But that scene just builds up so much tension, right? You don't know how it's going to resolve. Yeah. But you feel this tension being built.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because the tension is built and then we're just left with it.
Yeah.
And that's what this show does.
Until that second last or whatever scene. Yeah. When they're like, did he take the schvitz? And they're like, no, he kept his clothes on, right? Like, and we're still left with a lot of ambiguity with that.
Tony wants resolution, and we as people want resolution, but the show just does not give it to you.
Never.
And they're experts at playing with tension development.
Yeah.
In fact, and it's great actually where the show ends. So much tension is built, but we know that there will be some resolution. That's where, I mean, the show is still a TV show, and the benefit of the serial is the ability to have these kind of like long drawn out arcs and story narratives that play out in the end. And it's really interesting because they're really putting the drama into play now. And there's been a lot of tension built, and we know that something is going to happen.
And things
do happen.
Yeah.
The power struggles between Tony and Junior are going to kind of have to come to a head because of the way that tension's been built.
Well, and it's been set up with Mikey, so...
Yeah. So I guess we'll have to see what happens.
We saw Mikey's wife.
Yeah. Yeah. Do they have a video of her, of all of her scenes?
I think that could be the only one. Maybe there's one other. I'm not sure. Yeah. So, yeah, 2 more episodes, right? And I think we mentioned in our last episode talk that... Chase is the master of the penultimate episode. So actually it'll be in our next episode.
Some shit's gonna go down.
Some shit's gonna go down.
Yep. So that'll be fun.
Yeah. Do you have anything else?
Nope. Thanks for listening.
Yeah. And that's about it.
Look out for oranges.
Yeah.
Spoiler.
There's oranges.
There will be oranges. Okay. See ya.
Bye.